Can you tell me a bit more about Club 81 and what it meant for you at the time that you were there?
Well, guess what year it was founded? But there was this country, USSR. So
Okay, yeah.
and which was an interesting country, because Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is to say it could exist almost anywhere. It didn't have a proper name there, right? Union of Soviet Socialists. What the hell is that? Right? Was just a sound, USSR, or in Russian SSSR. So it's just this kind of it sounded ominous.
Right.
And there was a city, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, originally Petersburg, founded by Peter the Great, and then renamed Leningrad after Lenin's death in 1924,
Right.
and then restored to its original name already like many years later in 91 after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
That city, was the place where the Bolshevik Revolution occurred, right? It was always the city of contradictions. It was always a city of dark kind of basement spaces and very highly vigilant ideological overseers. And so the Leningrad KGB, for instance, was much more aggressive and sort of like tended to think outside the box much more than, let's say, in Moscow, where all the foreigners were. But Leningrad, St. Petersburg, has always been sort of like the cultural fulcrum of the country in some ways, because it mainly was just a thing unto itself, and because the confluence of architecture, this confluence of stone and light and water, is so uncanny that it's somehow, if you had any kind of predisposition towards artistic perception of the world, that would be the ideal place to be. But of course, by the same token, there were also a very large number of remarkably evil and unpleasant people born there, including the current president of Russia. So, it was part of the experiment, I would suggest, in controlling the underground writers, or samizdat, which is the Russian acronym for self-publishing. Samizdat. And I publish myself, essentially, which means that you can publish whatever you want, because otherwise, you won't publish anything at all, because you cannot be published by official outlets. You cannot be a member of the Union of Soviet Writers, because all of that had a very stark ideological underpinning. Um, and there was a large group of underground samizdat writers in the city, along with musicians, along with artists, of course. And the Leningrad KGB gave permission for them under the gave permission under the aegis of the Leningrad branch of the Union of Soviet Writers, to exist, to have a club of their own. And it was located at one place, first the Dostoevsky Museum, then in a basement space just a few steps away from the U.S. consulates, so that everybody could be observed 24 hours a day there. And then there was also another group within that club, which is the whole thing was I don't know, around 80 people maybe, or but there was a very quickly the club sort of like split into Westerners and quote unquote Slavophiles. And so I belong to the Western wings, and were interested in foreign literature and translations and so forth, and we kind of dwelled in this uninhabited and actually scheduled to be demolished building in this swanky part of town, in this huge loft space with a inclined floor with zero furniture except for that humongous table. And there we would just gather and drink a lot and talk about literature. The reasoning behind the KGB's decision was kind of simple. They really wanted to keep tabs on the samizdat writers, but they didn't want to run after every single one of them. So they just to get them all in one space and let them do whatever they want there. They want to drink their heads off and talk their crazy, apolitical or politically kind of hostile talk, or just no nobody would care particularly.
Were the
But
KGB present in the club with you at the
there were
time?
lots of informants there, of course.
Mm.
They had informants, occasionally they would stop by themselves to complain about the uncouthness and kind of lack of sophistication on the part of their colleagues from other departments, and so they just walked in there to discuss maybe literature and so forth, and which did not prevent them from actually maybe having a couple of people from the club just beaten up the next day, just because it was like strict separation of duty and leisure, and yeah, the only thing that really interested the KGB with regards to the underground literary community was that their work, uh, whose literary merits they could care less about. But that the work would not find its way outside the country and end up published somewhere in some small Russian emigre magazine journal somewhere, in New York or in London or in Paris or in Brussels or wherever it is. For some reason, it was considered to be a major over somehow, major mistake on the KGB part when just they let it slip away some piece of some manuscript and so forth. And so many of the samizdat writers were constantly in the process of active search of how to get their manuscripts smuggled out of the country, usually through the people who worked at the consulates, different consulates. There were no embassies in Leningrad because it was second city, not a capital. But there were lots of consulates, and so lots of people at the consulates had diplomatic immunity, which is to say, or they would not be frisked, or some very well-meaning foreign student of Russian, from the U.S. or from Canada or from somewhere, very idealistic, wanting just to help this struggling Russian underground writer. So they would just stuff it somewhere in there. So that was the agenda on the part of and so basically that was what they were interested in primarily, and the club sort of like from their standpoint served its purpose in that way, that they would have everybody under the same roof, and then they wouldn't have to chase everyone individually, finding out who is planning what. They would tell each other themselves, being drunk and so forth. So that was the overall idea, and it was kind of interesting. Then they repeated that with the rock club. They opened the rock club also first in the Soviet Union, and then Soviet Union started falling apart because while they were thinking outside the box and thinking about underground writers and other such immaterial things, they basically overlooked the fact that the Soviet Union actually fell apart, which was more or less in line of their direct duty to make sure that the Soviet Union does not fall apart.
Right.
But it fell apart.
So this kind of social experiment kind of backfired on
Well,
them then,
no, it didn't backfire because it didn't bear any, influence upon anything at all. All of that was so much in the margins of Soviet life that it cannot be kind of quantified as an influence. 1/10 of 1% of 1 millionth of 1%. Who cares? That's what this piece partly is about. Is about being surrounded by this sea of darkness and made all the darker still by those thousands of yellow dots of light in windows, and knowing that people who lived there, even though they were our fellow citizens and they, were us essentially, or more or less like us, but they were not us at all, and they had no idea what was in their heads. And so we actually wondered about that. What would it be like when there would be no communists and so forth? How would that? Well, now we know people actually wanted the same. They wanted to get back to the same. So that's generally what Club 81 was in a nutshell. In a nutshell, it was a grouping of unofficial writers, some of whom wanted to become official writers. So the carrot that the KGB and through them the Union of Writers were dangling in front of the many participants' faces was that they would be able to publish, and eventually 5 years later they did publish a collective anthology of prose and poetry, severely edited, severely truncated.